For 3 years, my Thursday nights had been identical. I would leave my quiet apartment, the one that always smelled faintly of turpentine and linseed oil no matter how much I aired it out, and walk the 7 blocks to the Crow's Nest. It wasn't a good bar. The floors were perpetually sticky, the air was a thick soup of stale beer and regret, and the music was always a decade too old and 2 decibels too loud. I didn't go there for the ambience or the company. I went there to feel the vibration of other lives around me, a low hum that made my own silence feel less like a void and more like a choice. It was a carefully constructed illusion of participation. I was a painter of quiet things, dusty window sills, a single pear in a ceramic bowl, the way light fell across an empty chair. My life mirrored my art. I observed. I rarely engaged. At the Crow's Nest, I would take the small, wobbly table in the far corner, the one tucked behind a structural pillar that offered maximum concealment, and I would nurse a single beer for 2 hours. I'd watch the shifting constellations of people, the boisterous group of coworkers letting off steam, the couple on a disastrous first date, the old man at the bar who seemed to have been carved from the wood itself. And I would watch him. He was the bouncer. I didn't know his name for the first year. To me, he was just a solid, immovable presence at the door. He was tall, broad in a way that seemed dense with purpose rather than just size, and he moved with an economy that bordered on stillness. He never smiled, not really. Sometimes the corner of his mouth would twitch in what might have been amusement, but it was a fleeting, private thing. His eyes, dark and deep-set, were constantly scanning, cataloging, assessing. They passed over me 100 times a night, but I was just part of the scenery, another fixture in the dim, smoky room, part of the quiet I painted. His name, I learned, was Marcus. I heard one of the bartenders, a young woman with a constellation of silver rings on her fingers, call it out to him one night. "Marcus, we're running low on limes." The name didn't seem to fit the mountain of a man at first. It sounded too soft. But then I started to turn it over in my mind, tasting it. Marcus. It began to settle around him, clinging to his quiet form like the scent of the cold night air that followed him inside. It gave my observations a focal point, a label for the quiet yearning that had started to bloom in my chest like a dark, secret flower. My life was a loop, a comfortable, lonely circle of my own design. I'd wake up, paint, eat alone, sleep alone, and on Thursdays, I'd go to the Crow's Nest and watch a man who didn't know I existed. It was safe. There was no risk of rejection, no possibility of awkwardness or misunderstanding. He was a painting I could study indefinitely, a composition of shadows and solid lines that I could admire from a distance without ever having to touch the canvas. I told myself it was enough. Then, one Thursday, the loop broke. The bar was more crowded than usual, a tide of bodies pressing in from all sides. I had my corner table, my fortress of solitude, but the noise was a physical weight. A group of men, loud and reeking of cheap cologne and belligerence, had colonized the space near me. They were celebrating something, a promotion, a birthday, the simple fact of their own volume. I tried to tune them out, focusing on the way the dim light caught the side of Marcus's jaw as he stood by the door, his arms crossed over his chest. One of the men, the loudest of the pack, stumbled backward, his arm catching my table. My beer, still mostly full, tipped and crashed to the floor, shattering with a sound that seemed to cut through the din for a moment before being swallowed again. The man turned, his face a mask of drunken indignation, as if the table had assaulted him. "Watch it," he slurred, pointing a thick finger at me. My throat went dry. This was the part one avoided, the part my quiet life was designed to prevent. Unscripted interaction. Conflict. "Sorry," I mumbled, my voice barely a whisper. "It was an accident." "You calling me an accident?" Another one of his friends sneered, stepping forward. They were closing in, their bodies blocking out the rest of the bar. My world shrank to their leering faces, the smell of their sweat and alcohol. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. This is what happens when you leave the studio. This is the price of pretending to be part of the world. I am frozen. My hands are flat on the sticky table, my knuckles white. I can't speak, can't move. I can only stare as their shadows fall over me. And then, a new shadow joined theirs, eclipsing them completely. A deep voice, calm and quiet, but carrying the weight of an avalanche, cut through the air. Is there a problem here? It was Marcus. He hadn't moved quickly. He had simply appeared, a solid wall of quiet authority at my side. He wasn't even looking at me. His gaze was fixed on the loud men, and it was flat, unreadable, and utterly chilling. The men, who had seemed so large and threatening moments before, suddenly looked deflated, like cheap balloons. The leader puffed out his chest. "This guy," he started, but his voice faltered under Marcus's silent stare. "He's a regular," Marcus said. The statement was simple, factual, but it held a universe of meaning. It meant I know him. It meant he belongs here. It meant he's with me. "You and your friends have had enough. Time to go." It wasn't a suggestion. There was a moment of tense silence, a standoff of wills. The man's drunken pride warred with the primal instinct for self-preservation. Instinct 1. With some grumbling and a final, hateful glare in my direction, they shuffled away, swallowed by the crowd, and then spat out into the street. Marcus didn't watch them go. His attention was already elsewhere. He bent down, his large frame folding with surprising grace, and began picking up the larger pieces of broken glass. "Stay put," he said, his voice still low. "I'll get a broom." He returned a moment later with a dustpan and broom, and with an efficiency that was mesmerizing, he swept away the evidence of the confrontation. He moved around my small table, his presence a warm, solid thing in the chaotic room. I could smell him then, not cologne or sweat, but something clean and simple, like soap and cold air and cotton. It was the scent of safety. When he was done, he straightened up and finally, for the first time, he looked directly at me. His eyes weren't cold or dismissive. They were just watching, waiting. I felt like one of my still lives, pinned and studied under that intense gaze. "You okay?" he asked. I could only nod, my voice still lost somewhere in my throat. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod in return. Then he walked back to the bar, spoke briefly to the bartender, and returned with a fresh beer, setting it carefully on my now clean table. He placed it exactly where the last one had been. "This one's on the house," he said. And then he was gone, back to his post by the door, resuming his watch as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. The loop had been shattered, and a new, terrifying, and exhilarating variable had been introduced. He had spoken to me. He had defended me. He had looked at me. For the rest of the night, I couldn't stop watching him, but now my observation was different. It was charged, laced with a frantic, hopeful curiosity. The painting had moved, and I felt, with a jolt that ran deeper than any fear, that it might be looking back. The following Thursday, walking to the crow's nest felt different. My steps were lighter, but my stomach was a knot of anxiety and anticipation. I was no longer an anonymous observer. I was a regular. I was the guy he'd saved. When I walked in, my eyes immediately sought him out at the door. He saw me, and for a fraction of a second, his gaze held mine. He gave me that same small, barely there nod, but this time, I felt it. It was a signal, an acknowledgement. I took my usual table, my hands trembling slightly as I set them down. I was hyper-aware of him, of his location in the room at all times. I tracked his movements as he paced the perimeter, as he spoke in low tones to the other staff, as he calmly ejected a girl who'd had one too many shots of tequila. Every action seemed imbued with new meaning. I was no longer just watching a bouncer. I was watching Marcus. I started noticing the small things, the details you only see when you're truly looking. The way he would subtly shift his weight from one foot to the other when he'd been standing for a long time. The fine, silvery scars that traced a map across his knuckles. The way his dark hair curled just slightly at the nape of his neck. He had a tattoo peeking out from the collar of his black t-shirt, the tail of a dragon or a serpent, its black ink a stark contrast against his skin. My sketchbook, which I usually kept tucked away in my bag, found its way onto the table. Under the cover of the dim light, my charcoal pencil began to move. I didn't draw him directly. I drew his hands, the way they rested on the door frame, patient and powerful. I drew the line of his shoulders, a solid, reassuring shape against the chaos of the bar. I was trying to capture the essence of him, the stillness he carried in a room full of noise. He saw me drawing once. His eyes flicked down to my table, to the sketchbook and the movement of my hand. I froze, my pencil hovering over the page, my face flushing with heat. I expected a frown, a look of suspicion or annoyance. Instead, his expression remained neutral, but he held my gaze for a beat longer than necessary before looking away. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The lack of a negative reaction was, in its own way, a form of permission. So I kept drawing. Week after week, I filled pages with sketches of him. It became our silent ritual. I would arrive, he would nod, I would sit and draw, and he would watch the room, occasionally letting his eyes rest on my corner for a moment. We never spoke. After that first night, there was no need. The space between us was filled with this quiet, intense observation. It was a conversation held in glances and charcoal lines. The tension was building, a fine, high-frequency hum beneath the surface of my Thursdays. It was in the way my heart would leap when he walked past my table, the air shifting in his wake. It was in the way I'd find myself holding my breath when he looked in my direction. The bar, once a refuge from my loneliness, had become a crucible. I was being reshaped by this silent connection, this strange, one-sided intimacy. One night, a few months after the incident, I was packing up to leave. As I shrugged on my jacket, I felt a presence beside me. It was Marcus. He was holding my sketchbook. I hadn't even realized I'd left it on the table. "You forgot this," he said, his voice a low rumble that I felt in my chest. "Oh, thanks." My own voice sounded thin, reedy. I reached for the book, but he didn't let go immediately. His thumb was resting on the cover, his fingers firm on the spine. My hand brushed his, and a jolt, sharp and electric, shot up my arm. His skin was warm, calloused, real. "You're good," he said, his eyes on the sketchbook, not on me. "You see things." My breath caught. It was the highest compliment anyone could have paid me. You see things. He understood. He wasn't just a subject. He was a participant. He saw me seeing him. I managed to say. He finally released the book, his gaze lifting to meet mine. In the dim, colored light of the bar, I could see the faint lines around his eyes, the deep, steady calm in them. "Leo," he said. It wasn't a question. He said my name. I had no idea how he knew it. Maybe he'd asked the bartender. Maybe he'd seen it on a credit card slip. It didn't matter. Hearing my own name in his low voice felt like an anchor dropping, securing me to this moment, to this man. "Marcus," I replied, the name feeling solid and real on my tongue for the first time. He gave that ghost of a smile, the barest upward tick of his mouth. "See you next week, Leo." He turned and walked away, leaving me standing in the middle of the crowded bar, my sketchbook clutched to my chest. The world around me faded to a dull roar. All I could feel was the lingering warmth where his hand had brushed mine, and all I could hear was the echo of my name in his voice. The canvas was no longer static. The painter was no longer separate. We were in the frame together now, and I had no idea what the finished picture would look like. I only knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and thrilling, that I had to see it through. The dynamic had shifted. The silent observation had been breached by words, by names. The following Thursdays were thick with a new kind of tension. It was no longer just my own internal yearning. It felt shared, a low hum of electricity in the air between my corner table and his post at the door. Our nods of greeting were deeper, our moments of eye contact held for a fraction of a second longer. These were micro-expressions, tiny shifts in the landscape of our non-relationship, but to me, they were seismic events. He started finding small reasons to move through the bar, his path inevitably taking him past my table. He'd be clearing a few glasses, a task I'd never seen him do before, and he'd pause for a second. "Crowded tonight," he might say, his voice a low counterpoint to the music. "Yeah," I'd reply, my mind racing to find something clever or witty to add, but always coming up empty. "It is." And he would nod, his eyes lingering on my sketchbook for a moment, and move on. The entire exchange would last less than 10 seconds, but it would leave me breathless, my charcoal-dusted fingers trembling. These brief, banal conversations were treasures I would hoard, turning them over and over in my mind for days, analyzing every nuance, every flicker in his dark eyes. Did the corner of his mouth lift slightly? Was his voice softer than when he spoke to others? It was an obsession, a meticulous study of a single, fascinating subject. The touches became more frequent, though they were always brief and plausibly deniable. A hand on my shoulder as he squeezed past my chair. "Excuse me, Leo." The warmth of his palm would seep through my shirt, a burning imprint that I could feel long after he'd gone. Our fingers would brush as he passed me a napkin to clean a small spill. Each time, that same electric jolt would pass between us, a secret acknowledgement that only we could feel. Or maybe I was imagining it. That was the constant, nagging fear. Was this all in my head? Was I just a lonely artist projecting his fantasies onto a kind, stoic bouncer? I lived for Thursdays. My painting suffered. The quiet objects in my studio seemed dull and lifeless compared to the vibrant, living art I was studying at the crow's nest. My focus narrowed until he was the only thing I truly saw. I learned the rhythm of his breathing when he stood near. I learned the precise shade of his eyes when the neon beer sign flickered across his face. I learned that the serpent tattoo on his neck coiled up and over his collarbone, its scales disappearing under the fabric of his shirt. This knowledge felt illicit, intimate, a collection of secrets I had no right to possess. Section The awkwardness was a constant companion to the yearning. I was a man who spent most of his life in solitude, communicating with the world through paint and canvas. Small talk was a foreign language I'd never bothered to learn. My conversations with him were stilted, full of long pauses that I would rush to fill with my own internal monologue of self-recrimination. Say something interesting. Ask him a question. Don't just sit there like a stunned fish. But I always just sat there, my mind a blank slate wiped clean by his proximity. Yet, he never seemed to mind the silence. He seemed comfortable in it, as if my lack of words was a relief. Perhaps he was a man of few words himself, and my quiet nature was a comfortable match for his own. This thought was a small, hopeful ember I fanned carefully in the lonely quiet of my apartment. One rainy night in late autumn, the bar was unusually empty. The handful of patrons were huddled at the bar, their voices a low murmur. I had my corner, but it felt exposed without the usual buffer of bodies. I was sketching, trying to capture the way the rain traced paths down the grimy window panes, but my focus kept drifting to him. He was leaning against the doorframe, staring out into the wet, dark street. He looked different without the usual press of the crowd around him, less like a bouncer and more like a man waiting for something. He turned, as if feeling my gaze, and walked over to my table. He pulled out the other chair, the one I always used to hold my jacket and bag, and sat down. It was the most audacious, world-altering thing he had ever done. Marcus was sitting at my table. My heart felt like it was trying to beat its way out of my chest. I closed my sketchbook. "Slow night," I said, my voice coming out as a croak. "Yeah," he said, his eyes scanning my face. "The rain keeps them away." He leaned back in the chair, and the simple wooden frame creaked under his weight. He seemed to fill the entire space, his presence a tangible force. "What are you working on?" He nodded toward the closed book. I hesitated, then pushed it across the table toward him. He opened it. My breath hitched. He was going to see. He was going to see pages and pages of his own face, his hands, his shoulders. He was going to see the depth of my obsession laid bare in charcoal and graphite. This is it. This is where he gets up and walks away, where he tells me to never come back. He flipped through the pages slowly, his expression unreadable. He paused on a detailed study of his hands, the one where I tried to capture the scarred knuckles and the strength in his fingers. He traced the lines with his own thumb, a strange, meta moment that made my head spin. He didn't say anything for a long time. The only sounds were the rain against the glass and the distant murmur of conversation from the bar. Finally, he looked up from the book, his eyes meeting mine. There was no disgust, no alarm. There was something else, something soft and curious that I had never seen in them before. "You never draw the eyes," he said. It was a simple observation. He was right. In every sketch, his face was slightly averted, or his eyes were in shadow, undefined. It was a subconscious act of self-preservation. To draw his eyes would be to fully capture his gaze, to admit that I was not just observing his form, but trying to see into him. It was a line I hadn't been brave enough to cross. "I can't get them right," I lied, the excuse sounding flimsy even to my own ears. He held my gaze, and I felt as though he could see right through the lie, right into the terrified, yearning heart of me. "Maybe you just need to look closer," he said, his voice quiet. It was a challenge, an invitation. It was the most vulnerable, terrifying, and hopeful moment of my life. The air between us was so thick with unspoken things it felt hard to breathe. I wanted to say something, anything to bridge that final, terrifying gap between us. I wanted to tell him that I saw him, that I'd been seeing him for years, that he was more than just a bouncer, more than just a subject for my sketches, that he had become the center of my quiet, small world. But I said nothing. The moment stretched, taut and fragile, and then it snapped. A group of loud students burst through the door, shaking off the rain and bringing a wave of noise and energy with them. Marcus straightened in his chair, the bouncer mask slipping back into place. The softness in his eyes retreated, replaced by the familiar, watchful assessment. "Duty calls," he said, pushing the sketchbook back to me. He stood up, his large frame once again a bastion of authority. "Don't be a stranger, Leo." He gave my shoulder a quick, firm squeeze and walked away to deal with the new arrivals. I sat there for a long time, my hand resting on the cover of the sketchbook, the warmth from his touch still tingling on my shoulder. He hadn't been repulsed. He hadn't been angry. He had issued an invitation. Maybe you just need to look closer. The question was, would I ever be brave enough to accept it? The invitation hung in the air between us for weeks. Look closer. It echoed in my head during the day as I tried to paint, and it was the first thing I thought of when I walked into the crow's nest each Thursday. I started trying. I would force myself to hold his gaze for a second longer, to really see the flecks of brown and gold in his dark eyes. I tried to decipher the meaning behind the slight furrow of his brow, the subtle tension in his jaw. It was like learning a new language, one spoken entirely in fleeting expressions and charged silence. He seemed to notice the shift. He started seeking me out more often, his brief visits to my table becoming a regular part of the night. Our conversations were still simple, surface-level observations about the weather or the crowd, but the subtext was a roaring river beneath the placid surface. Every word was loaded. Every pause was meaningful. We were circling each other, two celestial bodies caught in a gravitational pull, getting closer and closer with each rotation. The tension was becoming unbearable. It was a physical ache in my chest, a constant thrum of awareness that made my skin feel too tight. The safety of my detached observation was gone, replaced by the thrilling, terrifying reality of his presence, of his attention. I was no longer just the painter. I was part of the composition, and I had no idea how to act. The tipping point came on a night when the bar was hosting a local band. The place was packed, a heaving mass of bodies swaying to the loud, distorted music. Getting to my table was an ordeal, a constant battle against elbows and shoulders. I felt claustrophobic, overwhelmed. I saw Marcus near the stage, his expression tense as he kept a watchful eye on the burgeoning mosh pit near the front. I was trying to make myself as small as possible in my corner when I felt a hand on my arm. I turned, expecting another drunk patron, but it was one of the men from months ago, the one who had knocked over my beer. His face was flushed, his eyes narrowed with a mean, drunken recognition. "Well, look who it is," he sneered, his voice barely audible over the music. "The little artist. Your boyfriend on duty tonight." His friend appeared at his shoulder, laughing. "Gotta have someone to protect you, right, princess?" Ice flooded my veins. My old fear, the familiar paralysis, threatened to take hold. But then something else sparked within me. A flicker of anger. It was faint, but it was there. It was anger on Marcus's behalf, a hot, protective indignation that he would be dragged into their pathetic, hateful narrative. Before I could even think of a response, Marcus was there. He moved through the crowd with a purpose that parted the sea of bodies. He didn't shove or push. People just seemed to sense him coming and move out of his way. He placed himself between me and them, his back to me, a solid, protective wall. I couldn't see his face, but I could feel the sheer force of his presence. He didn't raise his voice. He spoke in a low, conversational tone that was somehow more menacing than a shout. "I told you once before to leave him alone," he said. "There won't be a third time." The first man scoffed, trying to project a bravado he clearly didn't feel. "What's he to you, anyway?" "You his." Marcus took a single step forward, and the man flinched back as if he'd been struck. The air crackled. The music, the crowd, everything faded away. There was only this silent, brutal confrontation happening in our small corner of the universe. "He's with me," Marcus said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, a blade of tempered steel. The words were simple, ambiguous, and yet utterly definitive. "He's with me." It wasn't just a statement of protection anymore. It was a claim. The two men stared at him for a moment, their drunken courage evaporating in the face of his cold, unwavering calm. They exchanged a nervous glance, then muttered something and melted back into the crowd, defeated. Marcus stood there for a moment, his back still to me. I could see the tension in his shoulders, the coiled energy that he held in check. Then, slowly, he relaxed. He turned around, his face a mask of neutrality, but his eyes, when they met mine, were blazing. They were full of a fierce, protective fire that took my breath away. He leaned in close, his mouth near my ear so he could be heard over the band. "You good?" he asked, the same question as before, but this time it felt different. It felt intimate. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. His scent enveloped me. That clean, soap and cotton smell now mingled with the faint, electric scent of adrenaline. He was so close I could feel the warmth radiating from his body. I had the insane urge to reach out, to place my hand on his chest, to feel the steady beat of his heart. His hand came up and rested on the back of my neck, his thumb stroking the sensitive skin just below my hairline. It was not a friendly pat or a reassuring squeeze. It was a possessive, deliberate touch, a brand. A shiver traced its way down my spine. The world narrowed to that single point of contact. "Good," he murmured, his breath warm against my ear. Then he pulled away, the loss of his touch leaving my skin feeling cold and exposed. He gave me one last, intense look before turning and disappearing back into the throng, resuming his duties as if the earth hadn't just tilted on its axis. I sank back into my chair, my body trembling. "He's with me." The words replayed in my head, a mantra, a promise, a confession. The ambiguity was gone. The question of whether this was all in my head had been answered in the most definitive way possible. This was real, and I had no idea what to do next. The fear was still there, but now it was overshadowed by a dizzying, terrifying hope. He had claimed me in front of them, in front of the whole world. The next move, I realized with a jolt, was mine. The rest of an evening was a blur. The band finished their set, the crowd thinned, but I remained at my table, anchored by the phantom sensation of his thumb on my neck. I watched him from a distance, our eyes meeting occasionally across the emptying room. The space between us was no longer just charged. It was alive, a humming, vibrant thing that pulled us together. I knew I couldn't just walk out tonight. I couldn't let this moment pass, couldn't retreat back into the safety of my quiet observation. He had taken a risk, laid a card on the table. I had to play my own. When the lights came up, signaling closing time, I still hadn't moved. The last of the patrons trickled out, leaving just me, the staff cleaning up, and Marcus by the door. I finally stood, my legs feeling unsteady. I gathered my things, my heart pounding a frantic, irregular rhythm against my ribs. "This is it. Walk over there. Say something. Say anything." I started toward the door, my path a direct, unwavering line to him. He watched me approach, his expression unreadable as ever, but his eyes were dark, intense. He didn't move as I stopped in front of him, so close I could see the slight stubble shadowing his jaw, the tiny scar that nicked his left eyebrow. "Thank you," I said, my voice barely a whisper. Before, didn't do anything." He deflected, his gaze unwavering. "You did," I insisted, finding a sliver of courage I didn't know I possessed. You said." I trailed off, unable to repeat the words, to ask him what he meant by them. A long silence stretched between us. The bartender called out a "Good night, Marcus," and the sound of the back door closing echoed in the now quiet bar. We were alone. "Leo," he said, his voice low and rough. "I'm going to lock up." It was a dismissal, a chance for me to leave, to let the moment dissipate into the night. But I didn't move. I couldn't. "Okay," I said softly. He stared at me for another long moment, a silent battle of wills playing out in the space between us. Then, with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of a long-held burden, he nodded. "The alley gate is this way," he said. "I'll walk you." It wasn't his usual route. My car was parked on the street out front. The alley was in the back, a dark, narrow passage I never used. But I just nodded and followed him as he led the way through the bar, past the stacked chairs and wiped-down tables, toward the back exit. The air was thick with the smell of bleach and stale beer, but all I could focus on was the solid shape of his back in front of me, the way his shoulders filled the corridor. He pushed open the heavy steel door, and a rush of cold, damp night air hit me. The alley was dark, illuminated only by a single, flickering security light high on the brick wall. It was a grimy, forgotten space, littered with overflowing dumpsters and broken pallets. It was ugly and desolate, and in that moment, it felt like the most sacred place on earth. He walked me to the heavy iron gate at the end of the alley. He pulled a key from his pocket and unlocked the heavy padlock, the metallic click echoing in the silence. He swung the gate open, a sliver of the empty street visible beyond. My escape route, my chance to run back to my safe, lonely life. I hesitated at the threshold, my feet rooted to the cracked pavement. I turned back to him. He was standing there, watching me, his face half in shadow, half in the sickly yellow light. The stillness was back, the patient, watchful waiting. My heart is a wild thing in my chest. I can't breathe. This is the moment. The precipice. Say it. Do something. Don't let this go. He takes a step toward me, closing the small distance between us. And then another. He reaches out, not to touch me, but to push the iron gate closed, shutting us in. The heavy clang of the metal echoes in the narrow space, a sound of finality. We are alone, trapped together in the dark. He sets his back to the gate, effectively blocking my exit. He just looks at me, his eyes searching my face, asking a question I don't know how to answer with words. So I don't. I take a breath, and I do the bravest thing I have ever done in my entire life. I close the final foot of space between us. But he moves first. In one fluid motion, he has his hand on my waist, spinning me around and gently, but firmly setting my back against the cold, rough brick of the alley wall. The texture of it bites through my jacket, a sharp, grounding sensation. His body is a wall of heat in front of me, caging me in. One hand is flat against the brick next to my head, the other still resting on my hip, his thumb pressing into the bone. His face is inches from mine. I can see every detail now. The gold flecks in his eyes, the fine lines etched at their corners, the way his lips part slightly as he breathes. The air is thick with the smell of rain-soaked asphalt and his own clean, personal scent. I am completely and utterly surrounded by him. Section Leo, he says, his voice a gravelly whisper. It's not a name anymore. It's a prayer, a confession. And then he leans in and kisses me. It's nothing like I could have ever imagined. It's not rough or demanding. It is slow, deliberate, and devastatingly soft. His lips are firm but gentle, moving against mine with a searching, questioning pressure. It is a kiss of infinite patience, of years of unspoken observation culminating in this one perfect moment. All the tension, all the yearning, all the fear melts away, replaced by a profound, earth-shattering sense of rightness. This is it. This is what I've been waiting for. My hands, which had been pressed uselessly at my sides, come up to fist in the front of his shirt, clinging to him as if he's the only solid thing in a spinning universe. The rough fabric of his t-shirt is a grounding texture under my knuckles. I kiss him back, pouring every ounce of my silent, pent-up longing into the gesture. I pour 3 years of watching, of sketching, of hoping, into this single, breathtaking point of contact. He makes a low sound in the back of his throat, a rumble of satisfaction that I feel more than hear, and deepens the kiss. His hand moves from my hip to the back of my neck, his fingers tangling in my hair, holding me steady as he tilts my head to get a better angle. His other hand remains braced against the wall, his body is solid, reassuring weight against mine. The cold brick at my back, the heat of him in front of me. I am caught between two elemental forces. It isn't a kiss of frantic passion, it's a kiss of discovery. It's a slow, unfolding conversation. His lips ask, and mine answer. It tastes of the night air and something that is uniquely him. A taste I know instantly I will never get enough of. The world disappears. There is no alley, no bar, no past, no future. There is only the rough brick against my back, the solid warmth of his body, and the incredible, impossible pressure of his mouth on mine. It feels like coming home to a place I've never been before. When he finally pulls back, it's only by a few inches. He rests his forehead against mine, his breathing heavy, matching my own ragged gasps for air. His eyes are closed. The yellow security light casts long shadows across his face, highlighting the strong line of his jaw, the curve of his eyelashes against his cheek. Leo. He breathes out again, the name a puff of warm air against my lips. I open my eyes, but he keeps his closed, as if savoring the moment, committing it to memory. My heart is so full it feels like it might burst. The silence that returns is different from all the silences that came before. It's not empty or awkward. It's full. It's comfortable. It's ours. He finally opens his eyes, and the intensity in them pins me to the wall. The guarded, unreadable bouncer is gone. In his place is just Marcus, and his eyes are full of a raw, staggering vulnerability that mirrors my own. "Took you long enough," he says, and the corner of his mouth quirks up in that ghost of a smile, but this time it reaches his eyes. A laugh bubbles up out of my chest, a sound of pure, unadulterated relief. "You were the one with your back to the gate." I counter, my voice shaky. "Had to make sure you wouldn't run," he says, his thumb stroking my jaw, a feather-light touch that sends shivers through me. "I'm not running," I whisper, and it feels like the most honest vow I have ever made. He leans in and gives me one more kiss, short and sweet and full of promise, before pulling back completely. He steps away, and the sudden cold that rushes into the space he occupied is a shock. He reaches for the gate, his movements sure and steady once more. He swings it open, revealing the empty street beyond. But this time, it doesn't look like an escape route. It looks like a beginning. He walked away from the gate without a word, leaving me standing there with the cold brick at my back and the lingering warmth of his lips on mine. I watched him disappear back into the bar, the heavy steel door closing with a soft click that echoed the closing of the gate. For a moment, panic seized me. Had that been it? A single, stolen moment in a dark alley, and now we would return to our separate corners, the tension released and gone. The fear was a cold, familiar hand gripping my heart. I had tasted connection, and the thought of returning to my silent, solitary life was suddenly unbearable. I stumbled out of the alley into my car, my mind a chaotic swirl of sensation and anxiety. The drive home was on autopilot. I don't remember the traffic lights or the turns. I only remember the feeling of his hand on my neck, the taste of him, the low rumble of his voice. Back in my apartment, the smell of turpentine felt alien, the quiet of my rooms felt oppressive. I walked to my easel, where a half-finished painting of a wilting sunflower sat, and I stared at it. It was gray and lifeless. My entire world had been rendered in monochrome, and that kiss had been the first splash of vibrant, terrifying color. I didn't sleep. I paced my small living room, replaying the entire night, the entire 3 years, in my head. I analyzed every word, every touch, every look, searching for confirmation, for reassurance. His final smile, the vulnerability in his eyes. Had to make sure you wouldn't run. It was a thread of hope, and I clung to it with everything I had. But the silence that followed was a breeding ground for doubt. He hadn't asked for my number. He hadn't made any plans. He had just walked away. The next few days were a special kind of hell. I jumped every time my phone buzzed, even though I knew he didn't have my number. I considered going to the bar on a non-Thursday night, but the thought of him not being there, or worse, of him being there and acting as if nothing had happened, was paralyzing. The overthinking, the internal analysis that had been my constant companion for years, went into overdrive. I had built him up in my mind as this stoic, immovable figure, and the reality of his soft lips and gentle touch had shattered that image. I was left with the terrifyingly human reality of Marcus, a man whose thoughts I couldn't guess, whose feelings I couldn't be sure of. By the time Thursday rolled around again, I was a wreck. I almost didn't go. It would be so much easier to stay home, to retreat back into my shell and let the memory of that kiss become just another story, I told myself. But then I remembered his words. I'm not running. It had been a vow. I had to see it through. Walking into the crow's nest that night was the hardest thing I'd ever done. The air was thick with the usual noise and smoke, but for me, it was charged with a new, terrifying potential. I saw him at the door, and my heart hammered against my ribs. He looked exactly the same, solid, watchful, his arms crossed over his chest. He saw me, and for a heart-stopping second, his face was a blank mask. My stomach plummeted. I was wrong. It was all in my head. He regretted it. Then, he gave me the nod. It was the same nod as always, but it was different. It was deeper, more deliberate. And his eyes held mine for a beat too long, and in them, I saw it. A flicker of warmth. A question. It was enough. I made my way to my corner table, my legs shaky. I sat down and unpacked my sketchbook out of sheer habit, but my hands were too unsteady to draw. I just sat there, nursing a beer I didn't taste, my eyes constantly flitting toward the door. He didn't approach me. The night wore on, a slow-motion torture of waiting and watching. The space between us was a chasm of silence and uncertainty. The regulars came and went. The music played, and we existed in our separate orbits. The memory of our collision in the alley a secret, invisible thing between us. Just as I was starting to lose hope, just as the familiar tendrils of despair were starting to curl around my heart, he moved. He walked over to the bar, spoke to the bartender, and then started toward my table. He was carrying 2 bottles of water. He set one down in front of me without a word. He twisted the cap off his own and took a long drink, his throat working. He didn't sit. He just stood there, a silent, looming presence. "Thought you might be thirsty," he said finally, his voice low. "Thanks," I mumbled, my fingers tracing the condensation on the bottle. My mind was screaming. Say something. Do something. Don't let him walk away again. He looked down at my sketchbook, at the blank page. "No drawing tonight. Can't seem to focus," I admitted, my eyes lifting to meet his. He held my gaze, and the whole noisy bar seemed to fade away. It was just us again, in our bubble of charged silence. "Me neither," he said, and the admission was a crack in his stoic facade, a glimpse of the same turmoil that was churning inside of me. That was it. That was the reassurance I needed. He hadn't forgotten. He wasn't indifferent. He was just as lost in the aftermath as I was. A wave of relief, so profound it almost made me dizzy, washed over me. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He unlocked it and handed it to me. The new contact screen was open. "My days off are Mondays and Tuesdays," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Put your number in. If you want. If you want." The choice was still mine. He wasn't going to push. He was going to let me come to him. My hands were trembling as I took the phone. His warmth was on the cool glass. I slowly, deliberately, typed in my name and number. I handed it back to him, our fingers brushing. The familiar spark was there, a jolt of confirmation. He looked at the screen, then slid the phone back into his pocket. He gave me one last, long look, a look that held a universe of promise, and then he walked back to his post. He didn't have to say another word. The message was clear. The ball was in my court. The next morning, my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "Coffee. Monday. 10 a.m. The grind." No name. No greeting. Just a simple, direct invitation. It was so perfectly him. My heart soared. I typed back a reply, my thumb hovering over the screen for a long moment before I finally hit send. Yes. The test came sooner than I expected. That Saturday, I decided to go to a matinee movie to get out of my head. As I was leaving the theater, blinking in the bright afternoon sun, I saw them. The 2 men from the bar. They were standing with a group of friends, laughing and joking. They hadn't seen me. I could have just turned and walked the other way, disappeared back into the anonymous safety of the crowd. The old Leo would have. The old Leo would have fled, his heart pounding, and spent the rest of the day hiding in his apartment. But something had changed in me. The memory of Marcus standing in front of me, a solid wall of protection, flashed in my mind. He's with me. And then, the feeling of his lips on mine, the quiet strength in that kiss. I wasn't just a scared observer anymore. I was the man he had kissed. I was the man he had texted. That knowledge was a thin but resilient layer of armor. I straightened my shoulders and kept walking, my path taking me directly past them. I didn't look at them, didn't acknowledge them. I just walked with a purpose I hadn't felt before, my head held high. One of them saw me. "Hey, it's the artist," he called out. I didn't stop. I didn't flinch. I just kept walking. "Too good to talk to us now, princess," his friend yelled after me. Their laughter followed me down the street, but for the first time, it didn't feel like a weapon. It felt pathetic. Their words couldn't touch me, because I had something they couldn't understand. I had the memory of a quiet, powerful man choosing me, seeing me, and standing up for me. And I had a coffee date on Monday. I didn't run. I walked all the way home, and for the first time in a long time, the silence of my apartment didn't feel like loneliness. It felt like peace. It felt like the quiet before the beginning of something wonderful. Monday morning arrived draped in a soft, gray drizzle that blurred the edges of the city. It felt appropriate, a gentle, quiet beginning. I changed my shirt 3 times, my hands fumbling with the buttons, my nerves a tangled mess. What do you wear to have coffee with the man who has occupied your thoughts for 3 years? In the end, I settled on a simple gray sweater and dark jeans, an outfit that felt like me, unassuming, comfortable, quiet. The Grind was a small, independent coffee shop halfway between my apartment and the bar, neutral territory. It was warm and smelled of roasted coffee beans and cinnamon. I was 10 minutes early, my anxiety propelling me out the door. I chose a small table in the back, one that felt protected, and waited. Every time the bell over the door jingled, my head would snap up, my heart leaping into my throat. He was exactly on time. He walked in, and he looked different. Out of his black bouncer t-shirt and in the light of day, he seemed both larger and softer. He was wearing a plain, dark green Henley that stretched across his broad chest, and worn jeans. He scanned the room, and when his eyes landed on me, that small, almost smile touched his lips. The relief that washed over me was so intense I felt lightheaded. He walked over, his presence seeming to shrink the small coffee shop. "Leo," he said, his voice the same low rumble, but it sounded different here, without the background noise of the bar. It was clearer, more intimate. "Marcus," I replied, my voice steadier than I expected. He didn't sit. "What do you want?" he asked, nodding toward the counter. "Oh, just a black coffee is fine." He returned a few minutes later with 2 large mugs, placing one in front of me before sitting down. He filled the space opposite me, his knees almost brushing mine under the small table. We sat in silence for a moment, the only sounds the clink of spoons and the low murmur of other conversations. The awkwardness I had feared was there, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the gentle, fumbling awkwardness of 2 people trying to learn a new way of being with each other. "So," he started, his large hands wrapped around his mug. "A painter." I nodded, taking a sip of the hot coffee. "So," I countered, a flicker of boldness surprising me. "A bouncer." He chuckled, a low, warm sound that I had never heard before. "It was wonderful. Among other things," he said. "It pays the bills." "What are the other things?" I asked, genuinely curious. The man I had watched for years was a complete stranger, a blank canvas. He hesitated for a moment, his eyes on his coffee. "I do woodwork," he said finally. "Furniture. Mostly custom stuff. The bar is just for the steady cash. And the quiet." I stared at him. "Woodwork. Of course." It made perfect sense. The patient hands, the quiet strength, the way he seemed to be building a fortress of calm around himself. I could picture him in a workshop, sawdust in his hair, carefully shaping a piece of wood. The image was so vivid, so right, it made my chest ache. "And the quiet?" I prompted. He looked up, his gaze direct and piercing. "You get it," he said. "You sit in that corner every week, not talking to anyone. You're there to be around people, but not with them. I'm the same. I stand at that door, and I'm in the middle of everything, but I'm not part of it. I'm just watching." He paused, his expression serious. "I was watching you too." My breath caught in my throat. "You were." "For a long time," he admitted. "I saw you sketching. I saw the way you looked at things. The way you looked at me." He took a deep breath. "I just didn't know how to." Crossed the room. It was a confession that mirrored my own fear, my own paralysis. We had been 2 quiet, lonely men, watching each other across a crowded room, both too afraid to take the first step. It wasn't just my story. It was ours. "So you had a drunk guy knock over my beer?" I asked, a small smile playing on my lips. He actually laughed this time, a full, genuine laugh that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "That was just lucky timing," he said. "But I'm not going to lie, I wasn't mad about it." We talked for over 2 hours. We talked about painting and woodwork, about the quiet satisfaction of creating something with your hands. He told me about growing up in a small town, and I told him about moving to the city for art school. We talked about everything and nothing. It was easy. The stilted, awkward conversations in the bar felt like a distant memory. Here, in the light of day, we were just Leo and Marcus. 2 men, learning the shape of each other's lives. When we finally left the coffee shop, the drizzle had stopped, and a weak, watery sun was breaking through the clouds. We stood on the damp pavement, the moment stretching out, uncertain. "So," I said, my hands shoved in my pockets. "I should probably. I have a project I'm working on," he interrupted, his tone casual, but his eyes were intense. "A table. I'm having trouble with the finish. You know about oils and stains, it wasn't really a question. You could come by my workshop sometime. Take a look." It was a flimsy excuse, a transparent invitation into his world, his space. It was everything I wanted. "I'd like that," I said, my voice soft. He nodded, a real, full nod this time. He reached out, and, instead of a handshake or a pat on the shoulder, he simply took my hand. His fingers laced through mine, his calloused palm warm and solid against my own. It was a simple, public gesture of connection that felt more profound than our secret, frantic kiss in the alley. He held my hand for a moment, his thumb stroking over my knuckles, before letting go. "I'll text you," he said. Then he turned and walked away, leaving me standing on the sidewalk, the feeling of his hand still warm in mine. I watched him go, his solid, reassuring form disappearing down the street. I went home to my quiet apartment. But this time, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt peaceful. It felt like potential. I walked over to my easel, to the sad, wilting sunflower. I picked up a palette knife and scraped the gray, lifeless paint from the canvas. I squeezed out tubes of brilliant yellow, deep umber, and vibrant green. For the first time in a long time, I felt the urge to paint, not the quiet, dusty corners of my life, but the bright, terrifying, beautiful color of what was to come. I wasn't an observer anymore. I was finally, a participant, and I couldn't wait to see what picture we would paint together.